In graph 13.9, we found ways of narrowing where within the isoquant graph the new profit-maximizing production plans will lie as input prices change. Starting with A as the profit-maximizing production plan initially, we showed, for instance, that an increase in the wage will result in a new profit-maximizing production plan lying somewhere in the shaded green region. In that region, the firm is hiring less labor, but it might hire more capital or less capital. We can't tell for sure from that graph. We'll explore this here in some more detail by seeing what kinds of input responses might result from an increase in the wage rate. As in graph 13.9, we'll begin with an initial production plan A, where that production plan involves a cost-minimizing way of producing XA level of output at the initial wage WA and rental rate RA. We'll furthermore assume that that production plan is also the profit-maximizing production plan at the current output price PA. When the wage rate increases, the firm initially cannot vary its level of capital, and is therefore restricted to the slice of its production frontier that holds capital fixed at KA. Along that slice, which represents a short-run production frontier, it will profit maximize where the marginal revenue product of labor is equal to the new wage, and it will therefore reduce the amount of labor and reduce its level of output. You can see this clearly by simply going back to the Chapter 11 short-run production frontiers, where we showed what happens to the profit-maximizing production plan as a wage increases. Now notice that at the short-run profit-maximizing production plan B, the isocost that passes through point B passes through it in a way that suggests that the firm would really like to have more capital than it's fixed to in the short run. In other words, by reducing its labor in the short run in order to equalize the marginal revenue product of labor with the new wage rate, the firm ends up with a production plan B where the marginal revenue product of capital is larger than the rental rate, and as a result the firm would like to have more of it. Thus, when the long run comes, the firm will want to increase the level of capital that it hires. As the firm increases its amount of capital, it'll be able to let go of even more workers because workers and capital are so substitutable. And therefore, it'll end up at a production plan C with a lot more capital and a lot fewer workers than it had originally, and fewer workers than it had in the short run after it laid off some workers. In the end, it ends up producing more than it did in the short run, but with fewer workers. We'll repeat this exercise in panel B, except that now we'll assume a production technology under which capital and labor are less substitutable than they were in panel A. We'll again assume that the initial production plan A is the cost-minimizing way of producing the output level XA, and we'll furthermore assume that XA is the profit-maximizing output level at the current output price. Thus, the production plan A is the profit-maximizing initial production plan at the initial wage WA, rental rate RA, and output price PA. When the wage increases, the firm is again initially restricted to operate on the slice of its production frontier that holds capital fixed at KA, and on that slice an increase in the wage will cause it to lower its level of output. Now look, however, at how the new isocost that passes through the short-run profit-maximizing production plan B relates to the isoquant XB. In panel A, it crossed that isoquant in a way that suggested that the firm would really like to hire more capital. Now, however, it's tangent to the isoquant, suggesting that the capital level that the firm is fixed to in the short run is just fine for the firm. It doesn't want to change that level of capital, either increase it or decrease it. As we show in the text more formally, the marginal revenue product of capital turns out to be exactly equal to the rental rate at the production plan B in panel B, just as the firm equalized the marginal revenue product of labor to the new wage rate. We therefore have the special case where just by adjusting its labor in the short run, the firm not only equalized marginal revenue product of labor with the new wage rate, but also equalized the marginal revenue product of capital with the rental rate. With both these conditions holding, the firm therefore finds itself with a long-run profit-maximizing production plan by just having made its short-run labor adjustments, and therefore there are no further adjustments required in the long run. Thus, the long-run labor response will be the same as the short-run labor response, and there won't be any response to the wage increase in the amount of capital that the firm hires. We'll now repeat the exercise one more time, but now we'll assume a production technology in which capital and labor are even less substitutable than they were in panel B. We again start with an initial production plan A that's both cost minimizing and profit maximizing for the current prices PA, WA, and RA. In the short run, the firm again is restricted to a fixed level of capital and therefore operates on its short-run production frontier along which it can only vary labor. An increase in the wage causes it to decrease the amount of labor it hires and thus to decrease its output level. Notice now, however, that at the new short-run profit-maximizing production plan B, the isocost that passes through B passes through it in a way that suggests that the firm would like to hire less capital than before. In other words, by equalizing the marginal revenue product of labor with the new wage rate, the firm ended up in the short run with a production plan at which the marginal revenue product of capital is less than the rental rate, and therefore the firm would like to hire less capital in the long run. As the firm lets go of capital in the long run, it will also let go of further labor, because labor and capital are very complementary. Thus, the firm will reduce its labor beyond what it reduced it to in the short run, and it will furthermore reduce its level of capital as it reduces output in the long run. Below each of these graphs, we can now derive the short-run and long-run demand for labor. We'll keep labor on the horizontal axis and put wage on the vertical axis, and therefore implicitly hold fixed the rental rate and the output price at the levels RA and PA we've assumed throughout. We'll begin with the wage WA, at which the profit-maximizing production plan is the plan A, where we use LA units of labor and KA units of capital to produce XA units of the output. LA is therefore the long-run profit-maximizing quantity of labor for the wage WA, and it therefore lies on the long-run labor demand curve. LA is also the short-run profit-maximizing quantity of labor demanded, assuming that capital is fixed at Ka in the short run. We know from our work in Chapter 11 that the short-run labor demand curve for a fixed level of capital is part of the downward-sloping portion of the marginal revenue product curve. Thus, point A lies on the short-run labor demand curve, holding capital fixed at Ka, and is equal to a portion of that capital level's marginal revenue product of labor curve. When the wage increased, our short-run profit-maximizing production plan changed to production plan B, where we used LB units of labor. Thus, LB must lie on the short-run labor demand curve for the fixed capital level Ka at the higher wage W prime. The long-run profit-maximizing production plan, however, changed to C, where we further lowered the level of labor from LB to LC. Thus, LC must lie on the long-run labor demand curve, which then turns out to be shallower than the short-run labor demand curve. We then repeat the same exercise in panel E for the scenario initially outlined in panel B. We again begin with the initial wage WA, at which the profit-maximizing labor quantity is LA, both in the long run and in the short run, assuming that capital is fixed at Ka. The short-run profit-maximizing quantity of labor at the higher wage is LB and must therefore appear on the short-run labor demand curve for a fixed level of capital Ka. Notice that since that short-run labor demand curve is equal to a portion of the downward-sloping marginal revenue product curve given that fixed level of capital, we know that at this new short-run profit-maximizing production plan, the firm has set wage equal to the marginal revenue product of labor. And since the firm is changing nothing in going from the short run to the long run labor demand curve will also cross point B. In other words, point C is equal to point B in this special case, making the long-run labor demand curve the same as the short-run labor demand curve for fixed level of capital Ka. In panel F, we'll repeat this again, this time for the scenario originally outlined in panel C. We again start with the short-run labor demand curve for the fixed level of capital Ka, which is equal to part of the downward-sloping portion of the marginal revenue product curve for that level of capital. At the initial wage WA, the firm hires LA units of workers. As the wage increases, the firm lowers its labor to LB, where the marginal revenue product of labor given the fixed level of capital Ka is again equal to the wage. As the firm lets go of some of its capital in the long run, however, the firm reduces its labor further because we've assumed capital and labor to be relatively complementary. Thus the long-run labor demand response is greater than the short-run labor demand response, causing the long-run labor demand curve to once again be shallower than the short-run labor demand curve. In the lowest three panels, we can also investigate what happens to the level of capital as the wage changes. Here we won't need to distinguish between the short and long run because capital is fixed in the short run. Therefore, we simply emphasize the initial production plan A and the final production plan C, and we show that capital increased from the initial capital level Ka to the final capital level Kc as the wage increased from Wa to W prime. We therefore get an upward sloping cross-price demand curve for capital. In other words, an upward slope in the curve that relates the quantity demanded of capital to the wage rate. Notice how this relates to what we found in panels A and D. We started in panel A with a production technology under which capital and labor are relatively substitutable. Thus, as the wage increased, labor became more expensive and the relatively substitutable input capital became relatively cheaper. The firm couldn't vary its capital in the short run, so it simply cut down on labor. But when the long run came around, it could increase the level of capital, and therefore did so, and in the process let go of more labor, because labor and capital are so substitutable. This caused the long-run response of labor demand to be greater than the short-run response, and it furthermore caused the upward relationship between the wage and the capital level in panel G. In panel B, on the other hand, the firm did not find it necessary to adjust the level of capital after it made its short-run adjustment in its labor input. Thus, as the wage increases, the level of capital remains the same. This results in a vertical relationship between the wage and the level of capital, or vertical cross-price capital demand curve. Notice what's happening here is that in panel B, we set the degree of substitutability between capital and labor in exactly the right way, so that when the wage increased, the labor adjustment alone was sufficient for the firm to enter the long run. Thus, there's no difference between the short run and the long run labor demand curves, and no change in the level of capital that occurs as a result of an increase in the wage. In panel C, on the other hand, the level of capital decreases as we move from the initial profit-maximizing production plan A to the final profit-maximizing production plan C after the wage has increased. This then results in a downward sloping cross-price demand curve for capital relative to the wage. What's happening here is that capital and labor are very complementary in the production technology in panel C. As a result, when the firm has to reduce its level of labor in order to bring the marginal revenue product of labor in line with the new higher wage, it'll have to let go of some capital in the long run because capital and labor are so complementary. But in the process of letting go of capital, it'll need to let go of more labor, precisely again because of that complementarity between capital and labor. So the long-run labor response is greater than the short-run labor response, and the level of capital falls as the wage goes up. If you look across the three middle panels, you'll see that the long-run labor demand response is always greater than the short-run labor demand response, except for the special case in the middle. This special case is a dividing line between two different reasons for the long-run labor demand response to be greater than the short-run labor demand response. In panel A, the greater long-run response happens because capital and labor are very substitutable. In panel C, on the other hand, it happens because capital and labor are very complementary. Either way, the long-run response is greater than the short-run response, but for somewhat different reasons. When labor and capital are relatively substitutable, then the firm will want to hire more capital in the long run, and because it's hiring more capital, and because labor and capital are so substitutable, it'll let go of more workers as it hires more machines. When labor and capital are very complementary, on the other hand, the firm will want to reduce its level of capital. But because labor and capital are so complementary, every time you reduce the number of machines you have, you also want to let go of some workers. And so in the long run, as the firm reduces the amount of capital, it'll also further reduce the labor force. You can now go back to graph 13.9 and make sense of the shaded green area. There we said if you start with an initial profit maximizing production plan A, and then the wage goes up, you'll end up somewhere in that green shaded area with a new profit maximizing production plan. From our work in graph 13.10, we now know that the capital level Ka will not change if we're in that special in-between case where the degree of substitutability between capital and labor is such that the initial short-run response in labor demand is sufficient to reach the new long-run profit-maximizing production plan. If, on the other hand, we end up with more capital than Ka, we're in the case where the production technology is such that capital and labor are relatively substitutable, and if we end up with less capital than Ka, we're in the case where capital and labor are relatively complementary.